Sometimes the heaviest burden a father can carry isn't the weight of his mistakes, but the silence of his shame. Every man deserves a second chance, even when he believes he doesn't deserve forgiveness. In Dry Gulch, folks knew Jeb Rawlins as the old cowboy who cleaned stalls for pocket change. They didn't know he was once a rodeo legend. They didn't know about the accident that killed his son. They didn't know he'd been running from that pain for 30 years. When young ranch hands dared him to ride Widowmaker as a joke, everyone expected him to fail. But when that gate opened, something happened that no one saw coming. 8 seconds changed everything. But what was Jeb really riding for that day? And why did his ride leave an entire crowd in stunned silence? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sun hung low over Dry Gulch like a copper penny against faded denim, casting long shadows across the dusty main street where pickup trucks lined up like patient horses waiting for water. October in West Texas brought a crisp edge to the air that made old bones ache and reminded folks that winter wasn't far behind. The smell of barbecue smoke drifted from the fairgrounds where the annual harvest rodeo was setting up, mixing with the scent of hay and the distant promise of rain. Jeb Rawlins stood in the shadows of Martha Henderson's barn, methodically cleaning a bridle with the same careful attention he gave everything these days. His weathered hands, scarred from decades of rope burns and bullhorns, worked the leather with a gentleness that spoke of respect for tools and time. At 68, Jeb moved like a man who understood that every motion should count, that wasted energy was a luxury he couldn't afford. The faded championship buckle, hidden deep in his coat pocket, caught against his ribs as he reached for another piece of tack. He'd carried that buckle for 30 years, a reminder of what he'd been before the world changed, before Tommy died, before shame became his constant companion, heavier than any saddle he'd ever carried. "Jeb, you don't have to work so late," Martha called from the barn door, her voice carrying the warmth of someone who'd watched too many sunsets alone. At 55, Martha Henderson ran the largest ranch in 3 counties with the efficiency of a general and the heart of a schoolteacher. Her husband had passed 5 years back, leaving her with 2,000 head of cattle and a loneliness she wore like an old sweater, comfortable but threadbare. "Almost finished, Mrs. Henderson," Jeb replied, not looking up from his work. He'd been calling her Mrs. Henderson for 3 years now, ever since she'd found him sleeping behind the feed store in town and offered him work and a place in her barn. She'd stopped correcting him about the formality, understanding that some men needed distance to feel safe. Martha stepped into the barn, her boots clicking against the concrete floor. The late afternoon light caught the silver in her hair, reminding Jeb of moonlight on water. She'd been beautiful once, hell. She was still beautiful, but it was a weathered beauty now, like good leather that had aged into something more valuable than when it was new. "The boys are setting up for the rodeo," she said, settling against a stall door. "Heard they brought in some new stock from Oklahoma, including that bull nobody's been able to ride." Jeb's hands stilled on the bridle. "Widowmaker? You know him?" "Know of him." Jeb resumed his cleaning, but his movements had lost their easy rhythm. "Mean son of a gun, from what I hear. Hasn't been ridden in 4 years. Martha studied his profile, noting the way his jaw tightened when he talked about bulls. She'd learned to read the signs over the years, the way his shoulders set when memories pressed too close. She knew about his past, not all of it, but enough to understand why he flinched sometimes when the radio played country songs about rodeos, and why he never watched when the local kids practiced roping in her south pasture. "You ever think about going?" she asked gently. "Just to watch?" Jeb shook his head without looking up. "That's not my world anymore, but it had been once. God Almighty. It had been his whole world." The memories came anyway, unbidden as summer lightning. Jeb Rawlins at 25, standing in the arena at the National Finals Rodeo in Las Vegas, 8 seconds away from his 3rd consecutive championship. The crowd on its feet, the announcer's voice booming across the arena. Ladies and gentlemen, riding Tornado Alley, the one and only Jeb Rawlins. The gate bursting open, 1,500 pounds of fury and muscle exploding into the arena, and Jeb riding it like he was born to fly. Those were the days when his name meant something, when young cowboys would ask for his autograph and seasoned riders would tip their hats in respect. The days when Tommy would sit in the stands wearing a miniature cowboy hat and a shirt that read, "My dad's the best," in block letters that Martha had carefully stitched by hand. Martha. Even then, she'd been there in the background of his memories, the pretty ranch girl who could rope as well as any man, and who looked at him like he hung the moon. They'd been something once, before life got complicated, before he met Tommy's mother in a roadside diner in Montana and made choices that seemed right at the time, but felt like mistakes in the hollow light of memory. Your boy would have been about 30 now, Martha said quietly, reading his thoughts the way she'd learned to read the weather. 32, Jeb corrected without thinking. Would have been 32 next month. Tommy Rawlins, born in a hospital in Amarillo during a snowstorm that shut down half the state. Raised on the road, sleeping in truck cabs and hotel rooms, learning to ride almost before he could walk. The brightest kid Jeb had ever known, with his mother's green eyes and his father's stubborn streak, and a smile that could charm the devil into buying ice. The accident happened on a Thursday in October, not unlike today. Tommy was 19, fearless as a summer storm and twice as dangerous. He'd been riding bulls for 2 years, following in his father's footsteps with a natural grace that made veteran cowboys shake their heads in amazement. That boy's got magic in his blood, they'd say, and Jeb would swell with pride so fierce it hurt. The bull was named Diablo, a massive black Brahma with horns like swords and a disposition to match. Tommy drew him in the short round at a small rodeo in New Mexico, the kind of dusty, forgotten arena where young cowboys went to prove themselves and old ones went to remember what they used to be. Jeb was there, of course. He was always there, coaching from the sidelines, offering advice that Tommy pretended not to need, but always followed. Keep your free hand high, son. Feel the rhythm. Don't fight it. Let the bull tell you the story. The ride started perfect. Tommy's form was flawless, his balance supernatural. For 6 seconds, he rode Diablo like he was part of the animal, moving with a grace that made the small crowd forget to breathe. Then something shifted. The bull spun left when Tommy expected right, and in that instant of miscommunication, everything went wrong. Tommy flew through the air like a broken bird, his body twisting in ways that bodies aren't meant to twist. He hit the dirt with a sound that would haunt Jeb's dreams for the rest of his life, a wet thud that spoke of bones breaking and dreams dying. The bull's hoof caught him in the head as he fell, a glancing blow that would have been nothing to a standing man but was everything to a falling one. Jeb was over the fence before Tommy stopped moving, cradling his son's head in his lap while the ambulance rushed across the arena. Tommy's eyes were open but vacant, his breathing shallow and strange. Blood seeped from his ear, and Jeb knew the way fathers know these things, that his boy was already gone. "Dad?" Tommy whispered, his voice small and confused. "I'm here, son. I'm right here. Did I make 8? Jeb looked at the timer, frozen at 7.5 seconds. "You made 8, Tommy. You made 8. It was the last lie he ever told his son." The funeral was held in Amarillo on a grey morning that matched the color of Jeb's soul. Cowboys came from across the country to pay their respects, filling the small church with weathered men who removed their hats and spoke in whispers about what a good kid Tommy had been, what a future he'd had ahead of him. Jeb sat in the front pew, dry-eyed and hollow, listening to the pastor talk about God's plan and eternal rest while rage burned in his chest like acid. After that, the world lost its color. Jeb tried to keep riding, tried to honor Tommy's memory by continuing their shared legacy, but every bull felt like betrayal, every crowd's cheer like mockery. He lasted 6 months before walking away from the only life he'd ever known, leaving his trailer in a parking lot in Tucson and disappearing into the kind of places where men go to forget who they used to be. For 30 years, he'd been running from that arena, from the sound of his son dying, from the weight of a father's failure. He'd worked construction in Colorado, fished in Alaska, picked fruit in California, anything that kept him moving, anything that didn't require him to remember who Jeb Rawlins used to be. "You know," Martha said, pulling him back to the present, "I remember when you and Tommy came through here that summer. He couldn't have been more than 12. Jeb's hands stopped moving entirely. "You remember that?" "Course I do. You two stayed in the bunkhouse for a week while you helped Dad with the roundup. Tommy kept asking me to teach him to make biscuits because he said they were the best he'd ever tasted." A ghost of a smile touched Jeb's lips. "He talked about those biscuits for months, said he was going to marry the woman who made them when he grew up." "Smart boy," Martha said softly. "Good taste in women." They stood in comfortable silence, the weight of shared memory settling between them like dust after a storm. Outside, the sounds of the rodeo setup continued, the clang of metal pipes, the low murmur of voices, the occasional bellow of livestock. The familiar sounds of a world Jeb had once ruled, but now watched from the shadows. "There's something I need to tell you," Martha said suddenly, her voice different now, heavier with something that sounded like confession. "About that summer. About Tommy." Jeb looked up from the bridle, meeting her eyes for the first time in the conversation. "I knew who you were," she continued. "Even before you told Dad your name, I'd seen you ride in Houston the year before. I was just a college girl then, working summers on the ranch, but I knew talent when I saw it, and I knew heartbreak when I saw it too." "What do you mean?" Martha took a deep breath, the kind women take before they say things that can't be unsaid. "You were different that summer, quieter, like you were carrying something heavy. Tommy felt it too. I could see it in the way he watched you, like he was trying to figure out how to make you smile again." Jeb set down the bridle, his full attention now on the woman who'd given him sanctuary when he needed it most. "The night before you left," Martha continued, "Tommy came to the kitchen while I was cleaning up dinner. Asked me if I thought his dad was okay. Said you'd been having nightmares, talking in your sleep about bulls and falling and not being good enough." She paused, her voice catching slightly. "That boy loved you something fierce, Jeb, and he was worried about you, even then." The words hit Jeb like a physical blow, knocking the breath from his lungs. He'd been so focused on his own guilt, his own failure, that he'd never considered that Tommy might have sensed his struggles, might have carried his own burdens. "What did you tell him?" Jeb asked quietly. "I told him that sometimes the strongest men carry the heaviest loads, and that the best thing a son can do is stand beside his father when the weight gets too much to bear alone." Tears came then, the first Jeb had shed since the funeral. They fell silently, tracking down his weathered cheeks like rain on parched earth. Martha moved closer, not touching but present, the way she'd always been good at being present for things that mattered. "He was trying to take care of you," she whispered. "Even at 19, he was still trying to take care of his dad." The knowledge was both comfort and fresh grief, a reminder that love doesn't end with death but carries forward, shaping the living in ways they don't always understand. Tommy had died trying to prove himself worthy of his father's legacy, never knowing that he'd already proven himself worthy of something far more important, his father's love. "I should have told him," Jeb said through his tears. "Should have told him he didn't need to prove anything." "You think he didn't know?" Martha asked gently. "That boy knew he was loved, Jeb. Maybe not perfect, maybe not exactly the way he needed to hear it, but he knew." As the last light faded from the barn, Jeb Rawlins finally began to understand that some burdens aren't meant to be carried alone, and that sometimes the heaviest shame can only be healed by the lightest touch of grace. Tomorrow would bring the rodeo, and with it choices he wasn't ready to face. But tonight, in the sanctuary of Martha's barn, surrounded by the honest smell of hay and leather, and the gentle presence of a woman who'd waited 30 years to offer comfort, he allowed himself to remember not just how Tommy died, but how beautifully, Brilliantly, he had lived. The harvest rodeo began as it always did, with the sun still high and the air thick with anticipation and dust. By 5 o'clock, the grandstands were filling with families and couples, their voices mixing with the sounds of livestock and carnival music drifting from the midway. Children darted between the adults, clutching cotton candy and chasing each other around the arena fence, while their parents claimed seats and shared gossip about weather and cattle prices. Jeb stood in the shadows behind the chutes, invisible as he'd learned to be, watching the familiar rituals unfold. Riders stretched and adjusted their gear, their movements careful and deliberate. Stock contractors checked the animals, making sure each bull and bronc was ready for their moment in the spotlight. The air hummed with nervous energy and the particular electricity that came before men and beasts tested themselves against each other in the ancient dance of rodeo. The evening began with the usual events: calf roping, barrel racing, saddle bronc riding. Jeb found himself drawn to the action, despite his intentions to stay hidden. His trained eye automatically assessed each rider's form, noting the subtle differences between amateurs and professionals, the tiny adjustments that separated a good ride from a great one. Old habits died hard, and some knowledge was burned too deep to forget. It was during the bronc riding that the younger cowboys began to gather near the back pens, their voices carrying the particular bravado that came with beer and peer pressure. Jeb recognized the type ranch hands in their 20s and 30s, competent enough to feel invincible, young enough to confuse recklessness with courage. He'd been their age once, full of the same swagger and certainty that the world owed him something. Jake Morrison led the group, as he usually did. At 26, Jake worked for the Diamondback Ranch and fancied himself a bull rider, though his experience was limited to county fairs and local competitions. He was handsome in the way that young cowboys often were, lean and tall with easy confidence and a smile that had broken more than a few hearts in 3 counties. Tonight, he'd had enough beer to feel philosophical about his place in the world. "You see old Widowmaker back there?" Jake called to his friends, gesturing toward the holding pens where the bulls waited their turn. "Meanest son of a bitch this side of the Pecos. Hasn't been ridden in 4 years. Billy Hutchins, Jake's constant companion and usual partner in questionable decisions, spat tobacco juice into the dirt and nodded sagely. "Heard he put Cody Williams in the hospital last month. Separated his shoulder and gave him a concussion." "Cody Williams ain't worth the powder to blow him up," Jake replied dismissively. "That bull needs a real rider, someone with experience." The group murmured agreement, each man secretly convinced he might be the one to finally conquer the legendary bull. They moved closer to the pen, where Widowmaker stood, a massive black beast with horns like curved daggers and eyes that seemed to hold ancient malice. Even at rest, the bull radiated danger, his muscles rippling beneath his hide like coiled springs, waiting to explode. The conversation might have stayed theoretical, might have remained the harmless bragging of young men with too much pride and not enough sense, if Jake hadn't spotted Jeb standing alone near the fence. The old man was watching the bull with an expression Jake couldn't quite read. Not fear, exactly, but something deeper and more complex. "Hey, old-timer," Jake called out, his voice carrying just enough edge to draw attention from the other cowboys. "You ever see a bull like that one?" Jeb turned slowly, his weathered face impassive. "I've seen bulls." Jake grinned, sensing opportunity. He'd noticed the old stable hand around town, had heard whispers that he used to be somebody once, though nobody seemed to know exactly who or what. There was something about the way Jeb moved, the way he held himself, that suggested hidden depths. But tonight, fueled by alcohol and the need to impress his friends, Jake saw only an easy target. "Bet you have," Jake said, moving closer with the particular swagger of a young man showing off. "Bet you've seen all kinds of things in your day, but I bet you never rode anything like Widowmaker there." The other cowboys began to gather, sensing entertainment. Billy laughed, a sound with too many sharp edges. "Hell, Jake, I bet he never rode anything at all. Look at him, probably spent his whole life mucking stalls and fixing fence. Jeb's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes, like a door closing or a light going out. He'd learned long ago that some fights weren't worth having, that dignity sometimes meant walking away from young fools who thought they knew the measure of a man by his current circumstances. "You boys have a good evening," Jeb said quietly, turning to leave. "Where you going, Grandpa?" Jake called after him, his voice louder now, drawing attention from other spectators. "We were just getting acquainted. Maybe you could tell us some stories about the old days, back when cowboys were tough." The insult was clear, and the gathering crowd began to sense the tension. Some looked uncomfortable with the direction things were heading, but others leaned in with the particular hunger people have for witnessing humiliation. Jeb stopped walking, but didn't turn around. "Come on," Billy added, emboldened by Jake's lead. "Don't be shy. I bet you got some great stories about watching real cowboys ride real bulls." Something in the way he said "watching" lit a spark in Jeb's chest, a flash of the old fire he'd thought was long dead. He turned back to face the group, and several of the cowboys took an involuntary step backward. There was something different about him now, a straightening of the shoulders, a steadiness in his gaze that suggested depths they hadn't suspected. "Matter of fact," Jake continued, not sensing the change in atmosphere, "I bet you've never even been on a bull. I bet you wouldn't last 2 seconds on old Widowmaker there." The challenge hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Around them, conversations stopped as people began to realize something significant was happening. Martha appeared at the edge of the crowd, her face tight with concern as she took in the scene. "Jake," she said sharply, "that's enough." But Jake was past listening to reason, past caring about consequences. He was 26 years old and bulletproof, surrounded by his friends and an audience, and he'd found an old man who seemed like easy prey. In his beer-soaked judgment, this was entertainment. "What do you say, old-timer?" Jake pressed, his voice carrying clearly across the arena. "You want to show us how it's done? Climb on Widowmaker and show these young punks what a real cowboy looks like?" The laughter from his friends was sharp and cruel, but it died quickly as they noticed the reaction from some of the older spectators. Doc Harrison had appeared in the crowd, his face grave with recognition. Martha looked like she might be sick. Even some of the professional riders had stopped their preparations to watch. Jeb stood perfectly still for a long moment, feeling the weight of 30 years pressing down on him like gravity. He could walk away, should walk away. Let these boys have their fun and return to the safety of shadows and obscurity. No one would blame him. Most people would call it wisdom. But then he thought about Tommy, about the conversation with Martha in the barn, about the weight of carrying shame that wasn't entirely his to bear. He thought about the boy who had died trying to prove himself worthy of a legacy he'd already earned by simply being loved. "All right," Jeb said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. "I'll ride your bull." The reaction was immediate and varied. Jake's grin faltered, replaced by something that looked suspiciously like uncertainty. Billy stopped laughing entirely. Martha stepped forward as if to intervene, but Doc Harrison caught her arm, shaking his head slightly. "You don't have to do this," Martha called out to Jeb, her voice tight with worry. Jeb looked at her, and for a moment his resolve wavered. She was right. He didn't have to do this. He was 68 years old with creaking joints and fading reflexes. Widowmaker was a young bull in his prime, mean as a snake and stronger than any animal Jeb had faced in his glory days. But then he thought about the expression on Tommy's face that last day, the way his son had looked at him with such trust, such certainty that his father could do anything. And he thought about the weight of shame he'd carried for 30 years, the burden of believing he'd failed the one person who mattered most. "I reckon I do," Jeb said simply. The crowd began to murmur, word spreading quickly through the grandstands that something extraordinary was about to happen. Stock contractors appeared, confused and concerned about liability. The arena announcer tried to understand what was going on. Through it all, Jeb walked steadily toward the back pens, his movements deliberate and calm. Jake followed, his friends trailing behind, with expressions ranging from excitement to growing unease. What had started as a cruel joke was taking on a life of its own, becoming something none of them had intended or expected. At the pen, holding Widowmaker, Jeb stopped and studied the bull with the practiced eye of a professional. The animal was magnificent and terrible, a perfect killing machine bred for one purpose, to remove riders from his back with maximum prejudice. His black hide gleamed in the arena lights, and his eyes held the kind of intelligence that made smart cowboys nervous. "You sure about this, old man?" Jake asked, and for the first time, his voice held a note of genuine concern rather than mockery. Jeb reached into his coat and touched the championship buckle hidden in his pocket, feeling its familiar weight and texture. Then he looked at Jake with eyes that had seen things the young cowboy couldn't imagine. "Son," he said quietly, "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." The crowd fell silent as the implications of what was about to happen began to sink in. Somewhere in the grandstands, a woman gasped. Children pressed closer to the fence. Old-timers who remembered legends from their youth began to whisper names and possibilities, and in the holding pen, Widowmaker shifted his weight and snorted, as if sensing that his evening was about to become very interesting indeed. Word spread through the rodeo grounds like wildfire in dry grass. Within minutes, what had started as a small group of cowboys taunting an old man had grown into something approaching a spectacle. People abandoned their seats in the grandstands, their conversations, their carnival games, drawn by the electric tension that preceded something extraordinary or tragic. Jeb moved through the crowd with the calm deliberation of a man who had made his peace with consequences. His weathered hands hung loose at his sides, but those who looked closely could see the slight tremor in his fingers, not fear, but adrenaline beginning to course through veins that remembered this feeling. This particular cocktail of anticipation and readiness that came before the gate opened and time slowed to heartbeats. He approached the chutes, where riders prepared for their moment of truth, and several of the younger cowboys stepped aside without being asked. There was something in his bearing now, a transformation that suggested depths they hadn't suspected. The stooped old man who cleaned stalls had somehow straightened, his movements taking on a fluidity that spoke of muscle memory older than some of the spectators. Martha pushed through the crowd, her face pale with worry and something that might have been recognition. She'd seen this look before, 30 years ago, when Jeb Rawlins was a name that meant something in rodeo circles. But that man had been young and unbroken, riding on confidence and natural talent. This man carried scars, both visible and hidden, and the weight of 3 decades worth of doubt. "Jeb," she called as she reached him, "please, you don't have to prove anything to these boys." He turned to face her, and she saw in his eyes the same determined calm she remembered from that summer when he and Tommy had stayed at her father's ranch. It was the look of a man who had made a decision that went deeper than pride or anger, a decision that touched the very core of who he was and who he had been. "Maybe I do," he said quietly, pulling something from his coat pocket. Martha's breath caught as she recognized the worn leather gloves he held, small gloves, sized for hands that would never grow larger than a 19-year-old's. Tommy's riding gloves, the ones he'd worn that last day, carefully preserved and carried like a talisman of memory and grief. The sight of those gloves seemed to crystallize something for the gathering crowd. Even those who didn't know the story began to understand that this wasn't about an old man's wounded pride or a young cowboy's cruel joke. This was about something larger and more complex, something that touched the deepest places where fathers kept their failures and sons lived on, in memory. Jake Morrison stood near the chutes, his earlier bravado evaporating as he watched Jeb prepare. The cruel entertainment he'd thought he was orchestrating had transformed into something he didn't understand and couldn't control. His friends gathered around him, but their laughter had died, replaced by a growing unease that suggested they'd unleashed forces beyond their comprehension. "Jesus, Jake," Billy whispered, noting the way some of the older spectators were looking at them. "Maybe we should call this off. Tell him it was just a joke." But Jake found himself trapped by his own pride and the expectations of the crowd that had gathered to witness whatever was about to unfold. To back down now would be to admit that he'd misjudged not just the situation, but the man at its center. And at 26, Jake Morrison wasn't ready to admit that his understanding of the world might be incomplete. Doc Harrison appeared at Martha's side, his weathered face grave with concern and something that looked like wonder. At 73, he was one of the few people in Dry Gulch old enough to remember when rodeo was more than entertainment, when it was a way of life that produced genuine legends. He'd seen Jeb Rawlins ride in his prime, had treated the cuts and bruises that were the price of challenging 1,500 pounds of fury and winning. "You know who he is, don't you?" Doc said quietly to Martha. "I know who he was," she replied, her voice tight with worry. "But that was a long time ago. Some things don't leave a man," Doc observed, watching as Jeb tested the weight and fit of his son's gloves. "They just get buried under enough pain to make him forget. But they're still there, waiting." As if summoned by their conversation, more of Dry Gulch's older residents began to appear in the crowd. Men who had followed rodeo in their youth, who remembered names and rides from decades past. Their presence added weight to the gathering, a sense that history was about to be revisited in ways that none of them had expected. Jeb seemed oblivious to the growing audience, focused entirely on his preparations with the methodical care of a craftsman. He flexed his hands in Tommy's gloves, feeling the worn leather conform to his fingers, carrying with it the ghost of his son's touch. The gloves were too small, but they fit well enough, and their presence seemed to steady him in ways that nothing else could. He walked slowly around Widowmaker's pen, studying the bull with the practiced eye of someone who understood that knowing your opponent was the difference between success and disaster. The massive animal watched him in return, its dark eyes intelligent and wary. Bulls, Jeb knew, were not stupid creatures. They could sense experience, could feel the difference between a rider who belonged in their world and one who was merely visiting. Widowmaker was magnificent in the way that only truly dangerous things could be, every line of his body, speaking of power and unpredictability. His black hide rippled with muscle, and his horns caught the arena lights like polished obsidian. This was not a bull that had ever known defeat, not an animal that had learned to accept the weight of a man on his back. "He's a big one," commented Sam Rodriguez, one of the stock contractors, as he joined Jeb at the fence. Sam had been supplying bulls and broncs to rodeos for 15 years, and he'd learned to read both animals and riders with equal skill. Mean, too. "Dropped Jimmy Patterson last week, before he even got settled." Jeb nodded, continuing his study of the bull. "What's his pattern?" "Spins left out of the chute, usually 3 or 4 times, then straightens out and goes to bucking hard. Kicks high, comes down like a freight train. He's got a trick where he'll pause for just a second, let you think you've got him figured, then explode sideways." Sam paused, studying Jeb's profile. "You sure you want to do this? I mean, no offense, but—" "How long since you've been on a bull?" Jeb interrupted gently. Sam considered the question. "Been about 5 years, I guess. Why? How long do you think it would take you to remember?" The stock contractor looked at the old cowboy with new interest, beginning to understand that there were currents running beneath the surface of this situation that he hadn't perceived. "About 2 seconds after the gate opened, I reckon." Jeb smiled for the first time that evening, an expression that transformed his weathered features and offered a glimpse of the man he'd been before grief reshaped him. "That's about right." Around them, the crowd continued to grow as word of the challenge spread beyond the rodeo grounds into town. The local sheriff appeared, looking concerned about liability and public safety. The arena announcer tried to understand what was happening, whether this was part of the evening's program or something that had developed spontaneously. Through it all, Jeb maintained his calm focus, his attention split between the bull he would soon ride and the memories that threatened to overwhelm him. In his mind, he could see Tommy at 8 years old, begging to be allowed to ride the mechanical bull at a county fair. He could remember the weight of his son in his arms, the smell of his hair, the absolute trust in his young eyes when he said, "Teach me to be like you, Dad." The teaching had come naturally, hours spent in practice pens, patient instruction about balance and timing, the gradual building of skills that would one day make Tommy Rawlins a name worth knowing in rodeo circles. But along with the skills had come the pressure, the weight of expectation, the need to prove himself worthy of his father's legacy. Now, 30 years too late, Jeb was beginning to understand that the worthiness had never been in question. Tommy had died trying to prove something that had already been proven by the simple fact of being loved. And perhaps, Jeb thought, as he prepared to climb into the chute with Widowmaker, it was time to stop requiring proof from the living and the dead alike. The crowd had swelled to nearly the entire rodeo attendance, transforming what should have been a routine evening of local entertainment into something approaching a pilgrimage. Word had spread beyond the fairgrounds into town, and people were arriving with the hurried anticipation of those who sensed they might witness something that would be talked about for years to come. Jeb stood beside the chute, his weathered hands resting on the rail as he watched the stock contractors prepare Widowmaker for what everyone understood would be no ordinary ride. The bull seemed to sense the electricity in the air, his massive head turning toward the crowd with what looked almost like curiosity. This was his arena, his moment, and he appeared to relish the attention. The memories came in waves now, unstoppable as a spring flood. Jeb found himself transported back to that terrible October day in New Mexico, seeing again the small arena with its weathered grandstands and the handful of spectators who had come to watch young cowboys test themselves against seasoned stock. It had been the kind of forgotten rodeo where careers were made and dreams were broken, where boys became men or learned the limits of their courage. Tommy had drawn Diablo in the short round, and Jeb could still remember the mixture of pride and worry that had filled his chest when he saw his son's name on the board. Diablo was a proven bull, the kind of animal that separated pretenders from the real thing. At 19, Tommy was young to be facing such stock, but he'd earned the right through weeks of flawless riding on lesser bulls. "You ready for this one, son?" Jeb had asked, as they stood together behind the chutes, the familiar ritual of preparation unfolding around them. Tommy had nodded, his young face serious with concentration. "I've been ready for this my whole life, Dad." And that, Jeb now understood, had been the problem. His whole life, 19 years of trying to live up to a legacy that had been built by a young man's need for his father's approval and an older man's need to be remembered as great. They'd both been carrying burdens neither had acknowledged, weights that had nothing to do with bulls or buckles or 8-second rides. The accident report was still there in his wallet, a yellowed piece of newspaper clipping that he'd carried for 30 years like a penance. He could recite it from memory. Thomas Rawlins, 19, of Amarillo, Texas, died Saturday evening from injuries sustained during a bull riding competition at the Mesilla Valley Rodeo. Rawlins, son of 3-time national champion Jeb Rawlins, was trampled by a bull after being thrown during his ride. He was pronounced dead at University Hospital in Albuquerque. What the article didn't capture was the sound Tommy had made when he hit the ground, a small exhalation that seemed to carry his soul away with it. It didn't describe the way Jeb had held his son's broken body while they waited for the ambulance, or the last words Tommy had whispered, not about the ride or the bull or the pain, but a simple, "I love you, Dad," that had torn Jeb's heart into pieces that had never properly healed. The guilt had followed him like a shadow for 3 decades. He should have seen that Tommy was pushing too hard, should have recognized the signs of a young man trying to prove himself worthy of love that had never been in question. He should have told his son that being Jeb Rawlins' boy was enough, that no ride was worth dying for, that a father's love wasn't contingent on 8 seconds of courage in an arena full of strangers. "Jeb!" Martha's voice brought him back to the present, and he turned to find her standing close enough to touch, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Tell me, this isn't about Tommy. Tell me you're not trying to ride that bull for him." The directness of the question cut through his defenses like a blade through silk. He looked at this woman who had known him before and after, who had offered him sanctuary when he needed it most, and found he couldn't lie to her. "Maybe it is," he said quietly. "Maybe it's time." Time for what? To get yourself killed? To leave everyone who cares about you wondering why you threw your life away on a dare from some drunk cowboys? Her words carried the weight of 30 years of unspoken feelings, of watching him struggle with ghosts and guilt, while she stood helplessly on the sidelines. Martha Henderson had loved Jeb Rawlins when he was young and golden, and she had continued loving him through his fall from grace and his long years of exile. But love, she was learning, wasn't always enough to save someone from themselves. "He died trying to make me proud," Jeb said, his voice barely audible above the noise of the crowd. "Died, thinking he had to prove something to me that was already proven just by being my son. And you think riding Widowmaker is going to change that?" Jeb was quiet for a long moment, watching as the stock contractors secured the bull in the chute. The massive animal's presence seemed to fill the space around them, radiating danger and possibility in equal measure. "I think," he said finally, "that maybe it's time I stopped running from what happened and started living with it. Maybe it's time I remembered that I was someone before I became the man who lost his son." Doc Harrison approached them, his medical bag in hand and his face grave with the particular concern that came from understanding exactly how dangerous the next few minutes might be. He'd been ringside for rodeos across 3 states, had treated everything from broken bones to traumatic brain injuries, and he knew better than most what bulls like Widowmaker could do to the human body. "Jeb," he said, his voice carrying the authority of age and experience, "I've got to ask you this as a friend and as a doctor. When's the last time you've been on a bull?" 30 years, Jeb replied without hesitation. "And how old are you?" 68. Doc Harrison nodded grimly. "That's what I was afraid of. Your reflexes aren't what they were. Your bones are more brittle. Your healing time is longer. If that bull hurts you—" "He might," Jeb interrupted gently. "But Doc, I've been hurt for 30 years. Maybe it's time to find out if I can heal." The stock contractors were ready now, Widowmaker secured in the chute and waiting with the patient malevolence of a predator that knew its time was coming. The crowd pressed closer to the arena fence, their conversations dying as they sensed the approach of the moment they'd all come to witness. Jake Morrison stood with his friends, his earlier bravado completely gone. What had started as cruel entertainment had evolved into something that made him deeply uncomfortable, something that suggested he'd misjudged not just the old cowboy, but the entire situation. The laughter and mockery that had seemed so appropriate an hour ago now felt petty and small in the face of whatever was about to unfold. "Maybe we should stop this," Billy whispered, echoing Jake's own growing unease. "Tell him we were just fooling around." But it was too late for that now. Too many people had gathered, too much had been said, too much weight had been placed on the next few minutes. Like it or not, they'd set something in motion that had taken on a life of its own, something that would play out regardless of their intentions or regrets. Jeb walked slowly toward the chute, where Widowmaker waited, each step carrying him further from the safety of obscurity and closer to a reckoning that had been 3 decades in the making. In his pocket, the championship buckle pressed against his ribs, a reminder of who he'd been. On his hands, Tommy's gloves carried the memory of who his son had been. And in his heart, a mixture of grief and hope warred for dominance as he prepared to discover who he might yet become. The chute area had taken on the hushed intensity of a cathedral, the usual chaos of rodeo preparation, replaced by something approaching reverence. Even the carnival music from the midway seemed muted, as if the very air understood that what was about to happen transcended ordinary entertainment. Jeb approached Widowmaker's holding pen with the deliberate calm of a man walking toward his destiny. Each step measured and purposeful. The bull dominated the narrow confines of the chute like a dark god of destruction, his massive frame barely contained by the steel rails that separated him from the arena floor. Nearly 1,800 pounds of muscle and malice, Widowmaker had earned his reputation through 4 years of systematically dismantling every cowboy brave or foolish enough to climb on his back. His black hide gleamed under the arena lights, and his eyes held the cold intelligence of a creature that understood his purpose in this world, to prove that some forces of nature could not be tamed. Jeb paused at the gate, studying the bull with the practiced eye of someone who had made a career of reading animal behavior. Widowmaker's stance, the set of his massive head, the way he shifted his weight, all of it told a story to those who knew how to listen. This was not just a powerful animal, this was a strategist, a bull that had learned to use his size and strength with devastating efficiency. "He's got a pattern," called out Sam Rodriguez, the stock contractor, his voice tight with concern. "Spins left coming out of the gate, usually 4 or 5 turns, then he straightens and goes to serious bucking. Watch for him to pause. That's when he's setting up for his next move." The information was valuable, but Jeb knew that no amount of preparation could truly ready a man for what Widowmaker would bring. Bulls like this one operated on instinct and fury, their movements flowing from some primal source that defied prediction. You could study them, respect them, but ultimately you had to trust in your own skill and whatever grace the universe might provide. The crowd had grown so large that the arena management was struggling to maintain order. People pressed against the fence, standing on bleacher seats, craning for a view of the old cowboy, who had somehow commanded this kind of attention. The mixture of faces told its own story, young families drawn by curiosity, old-timers who sensed they might witness something that would become legend, and everywhere the particular tension that came when ordinary people found themselves in the presence of something extraordinary. Among the spectators, conversations flowed in hushed tones that carried fragments of memory and speculation. Some of the older ranchers claimed to remember Jeb from his glory days, their descriptions growing more elaborate with each telling. Others wondered aloud whether this was wisdom or madness, whether they were about to witness triumph or tragedy. "I seen him ride at the Houston Livestock Show," claimed Earl Bronson, a weathered rancher who'd been following rodeo for 60 years. "Must have been 1975, maybe 76. Rode a bull called Satan's Helper, meanest damn animal I ever saw. Made it look easy as breathing." "That was a long time ago," replied his neighbor, voicing the concern that hung over the entire gathering. "Man gets old, loses his reflexes. Bull don't care what you used to be." The truth of that observation was not lost on anyone present, least of all Jeb himself. He could feel the weight of years in his joints, the stiffness that came with decades of hard living and harder choices. His hands, scarred by rope burns and broken bones, trembled slightly as he reached out to touch the chute rail. But beneath the evidence of aging was something else, muscle memory that ran deeper than conscious thought, knowledge that had been earned through years of facing down animals that could kill with casual indifference. Martha stood 20 feet away, her face pale with worry and something that looked like prayer. She'd loved this man for most of her adult life, had watched him disappear into guilt and shame after Tommy's death, had offered him sanctuary when he'd finally stopped running. Now she was about to watch him risk everything on what might be pride or penance or simple human need to prove that some part of him remained unbroken. "Martha," Doc Harrison said quietly, moving to stand beside her, "you might want to consider stepping back a bit if this goes wrong." "If this goes wrong, I want to be close enough to help," she replied firmly. "I've loved him through 30 years of wrong. I'm not backing away now." The doctor nodded, understanding the kind of loyalty that transcended logic or self-preservation. He'd seen it before in rodeo families, the fierce bonds that held people together through triumph and disaster. Love, he'd learned, was not always safe or sensible, but it was often the only thing that mattered when everything else fell away. Jake Morrison watched from the edge of the crowd, his earlier bravado completely gone. What had started as a cruel joke had transformed into something that made him deeply uncomfortable, something that suggested forces beyond his understanding or control. His friends stood silent beside him, their faces reflecting the same mixture of fascination and regret that comes from realizing you've set events in motion that can't be stopped. The weight of responsibility pressed down on Jake like a physical thing. He was the one who had issued the challenge, who had turned a quiet old man into the center of this gathering storm. If something terrible happened in the next few minutes, he would carry that burden for the rest of his life. The thought made his stomach churn with something that felt suspiciously like genuine remorse. "Jesus," Billy whispered, his voice barely audible. "Look at all these people. What have we done?" Jake didn't answer, couldn't answer. He was beginning to understand that some actions carried consequences far beyond their intention, that words spoken in anger or pride could ripple outward in ways that changed everything they touched. The old cowboy approaching Widowmaker's chute was no longer a target for amusement. He was a human being with his own history and pain, someone who deserved better than to be the butt of young men's jokes. Jeb climbed the rails beside the chute, his silver spurs catching the arena lights as he settled into position above the massive bull. From this vantage point, Widowmaker looked even more intimidating, his broad back rippling with muscle that could explode into violence without warning. This close, Jeb could smell the animal musk, could feel the heat radiating from the bull's body, could sense the coiled energy waiting to be unleashed. He pulled his championship spurs from his coat pocket, silver-plated and sharp as razors. They had been his trademark in the days when his name meant something in rodeo circles. These spurs had ridden countless bulls, had been the difference between success and failure more times than he could count. Now, as he strapped them onto his boots with hands that remembered the motions from decades past, they felt like talismans connecting him to the man he used to be. The crowd fell silent as they watched this ritual preparation, understanding somehow that they were witnessing something sacred. These weren't just the movements of an old man getting ready to ride a bull. These were the ceremonies of a warrior preparing for battle, the careful rituals that separated those who belonged in this arena from those who merely visited it. Widowmaker shifted beneath him, the massive animal's awareness of his presence evident in every line of his body. The bull's head turned slightly, one dark eye fixing on the man who dared to enter his domain. In that gaze, Jeb saw no malice, no personal animosity, only the pure, undiluted essence of what this animal was, a force of nature that would test him with absolute indifference to outcome. The moment stretched between them, man and beast, past and present, everything that had been and everything that might yet be balanced on the edge of 8 seconds that would either kill him or set him free. The arena had taken on the quality of a held breath, thousands of people united in a single moment of anticipation that seemed to stretch beyond the normal boundaries of time. Jeb settled himself above Widowmaker, his weathered hands gripping the chute rails as he prepared for the most important 8 seconds of his life, not because they might make him famous again, but because they might finally make him whole. From his coat pocket, he withdrew a set of worn wooden rosary beads, their surface polished smooth by decades of worried fingers. Tommy had given them to him for Christmas when he was 12, saving up allowance money for weeks to buy what he considered a proper gift for a father who seemed to have everything. The beads had been blessed by Father Miguel at St. Anthony's in Amarillo, and Tommy had presented them with the solemn ceremony that children reserve for truly important occasions. "These are for when you ride, Dad," Tommy had said, his young face serious with the weight of his gift. "So you'll always be safe, and so you'll always come home." Jeb had carried them ever since, through hundreds of rides and thousands of miles, through triumph and disaster and everything in between. They had been in his pocket the day Tommy died, a cruel irony that had taken him years to understand. The son's protection for the father, offered freely and without reservation, while the father had failed to protect what mattered most. Now, as he held them one final time, Jeb understood that the beads had never been about protection from bulls or broken bones. They had been about love, pure and simple, a 12-year-old boy's way of saying that his father's safety mattered more than glory or championships or anything else the world might offer. Tommy's gift had been the knowledge that someone cared whether he came home, and that knowledge had sustained him through years when nothing else could. The crowd watched in respectful silence as Jeb bowed his head and moved his lips in what was clearly prayer. Some recognized the ritual from their own childhoods, the particular way that cowboys and their families appealed to powers greater than their own skill before testing themselves against forces that could not be reasoned with or negotiated with. Others simply understood that they were witnessing something sacred, something that transcended the ordinary boundaries of entertainment and sport. Martha felt tears spill down her cheeks as she watched the man she'd loved for most of her adult life prepare for what might be his final act. The sight of him holding those rosary beads brought back memories of the young cowboy. He'd been confident and golden, but never arrogant, always understanding that his talent was a gift that required gratitude and respect. She'd been 25 then, convinced that life held nothing but possibilities, that love was simple and futures were guaranteed. "He's not doing this for pride," she whispered to Doc Harrison, the realization hitting her with sudden clarity. "He's doing this for forgiveness." The doctor nodded, his trained eye taking in the way Jeb held himself, the particular calm that came over men who had made peace with whatever consequences might follow their choices. "Sometimes," Doc said quietly, "a man has to risk everything to find out what he's really made of. Sometimes that's the only way to live with what he's done or failed to do." The words carried weight beyond their surface meaning, touching on truths that both of them had learned through their own decades of living and losing and finding ways to continue. Life, they understood, was not always about safety or wisdom or sensible choices. Sometimes it was about moments when everything that mattered hung in the balance, when the only choice was between courage and cowardice, between facing the truth or running from it forever. Jake Morrison stood with his friends, his face pale with the growing understanding of what he had set in motion. The cruel entertainment he'd thought he was orchestrating had transformed into something that made him feel small and ashamed, something that revealed the difference between the kind of man he thought he was and the kind of man he actually needed to become. "We should stop this," he said suddenly, his voice tight with genuine concern. "Go tell him it was just a joke, that nobody expects him to actually do it." But even as he spoke the words, Jake knew they were meaningless. Too much had happened, too many people had gathered, too much weight had been placed on the next few minutes for simple words to change anything. The old cowboy above Widowmaker had accepted more than a dare. He had accepted a reckoning that had been 30 years in the making. Billy Hutchins shifted uncomfortably beside his friend, his own conscience beginning to assert itself in ways that felt unfamiliar and unwelcome. "Maybe we should have thought about this before we started running our mouths," he said quietly. "Maybe we should have minded our own business." The admission carried the bitter taste of wisdom acquired too late, the particular regret that comes from understanding that words spoken in anger or amusement can carry consequences far beyond their intention. Jake nodded, accepting his friend's rebuke as the truth it was, but knowing that acceptance changed nothing about what was about to happen. Around them, the crowd had grown so quiet that individual voices carried with startling clarity. A child asked her mother why everyone was so serious. An old man explained to his grandson about the difference between courage and recklessness, and why sometimes the line between them was too thin to see. A woman prayed audibly for the safety of a man she'd never met, but whose story had somehow become part of her own evening. The arena announcer, confused by the unofficial nature of what was happening, but recognizing its importance, finally gave up trying to understand and simply described what everyone could see. An old cowboy preparing to ride a bull that had never been conquered, a moment that felt larger than the sum of its parts. Jeb finished his prayer and carefully returned the rosary beads to his pocket, where they settled next to the championship buckle and the newspaper clipping that had defined his life for 3 decades. These artifacts of memory and loss would ride with him into whatever came next, physical reminders of who he had been, what he had lost, and why this moment mattered more than simple pride or wounded dignity. He looked out over the crowd, seeing faces that ranged from curious to concerned to genuinely fearful for his safety. Among them he found Martha, her eyes bright with tears and love and terror for what might happen in the next few minutes. Their gaze met across the distance, and he saw in her expression everything that had remained unspoken between them for 30 years. Regret for time lost, hope for time that might remain, and the kind of love that endures through separation and silence and the accumulation of years. Doc Harrison stood beside her, his medical bag ready and his face grave with professional concern. But Jeb could see the respect in the older man's eyes, the recognition of someone who understood what it meant to face the thing you feared most and refused to back down. The stock contractors were ready now, their hands on the gate mechanism that would release Widowmaker into the arena. The bull himself seemed to sense the approach of his moment, his massive body coiled with the particular tension that preceded explosive action. This was what he had been bred for, what his entire existence had led toward 8 seconds of pure challenge against whatever courage and skill the man on his back could muster. Time slowed to heartbeats as Jeb prepared to climb down onto the bull's back, to commit himself irrevocably to whatever fate awaited him in the arena. In his mind, he could hear Tommy's voice, young and eager and full of love. "Teach me to be like you, Dad." And for the first time in 30 years, Jeb thought he might finally understand what that meant. Jeb climbed down into the chute, settling himself carefully onto Widowmaker's broad back, feeling the massive animal's heat and power beneath him, like sitting on top of a barely contained explosion. The bull's muscles rippled with tension. Every fiber of his being focused on the moment when the gate would open, and he could unleash the full fury of his nature. This close, Jeb could feel the animal's heartbeat, strong and steady as a war drum, counting down to violence. The crowd fell into absolute silence, the kind of quiet that comes when thousands of people hold their breath at once. Even the sounds from the midway seemed muted, as if the entire world understood that something extraordinary was about to unfold. Jeb adjusted his grip, feeling for the rope that would be his only connection to staying on the bull's back, his weathered hands automatically performing movements he'd learned 40 years ago. Then, in a gesture that no one expected, Jeb reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew a sealed envelope. The motion was deliberate and careful, as if the contents were too precious or too terrible to risk damaging. He looked down at Martha, who stood pressed against the arena fence, her face tight with worry and love and fear for what the next few minutes might bring. "Martha," he called quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the hushed arena. "I need you to read this if—" He paused, correcting himself. "I need you to read this after." He tossed the envelope down to her, and she caught it with trembling hands, her heart hammering as she recognized the letterhead of Dr. Morrison's medical practice in Amarillo. The envelope was still sealed, but she could feel its weight, could sense in its very presence that whatever it contained would change everything about this moment and everything that came after. "What is this?" she called up to him, though some part of her already feared the answer. Jeb's response was quiet, but clear enough for those nearby to hear. "The reason I'm up here." Martha's hands shook as she opened the envelope, unfolding the single sheet of medical letterhead with the care reserved for documents that carry the power to destroy worlds. Her eyes scanned the formal language, the clinical terminology that doctors use to deliver news that no one wants to receive, and the blood drained from her face as the meaning became clear. The diagnosis was pancreatic cancer, stage 4, with metastases to the liver and lymph nodes. The prognosis was measured in months, not years. Treatment options were limited and focused on comfort rather than cure. The letter was dated 3 days ago. Martha's gasp was audible across the arena, and Doc Harrison moved quickly to her side, taking the letter from her nerveless fingers and reading it with the rapid comprehension of someone who'd delivered similar news himself too many times to count. His face went grey as he absorbed the implications, understanding instantly why Jeb had chosen this moment, this way, to face what was coming. "Sweet Jesus," Doc whispered, loud enough for several nearby spectators to hear. The words rippled through the crowd like a stone dropped in still water, creating circles of understanding that spread outward as people began to realize that what they were witnessing was not a broken old man seeking redemption, but a dying man choosing how to spend his final months or minutes. Jeb sat calmly on Widowmaker's back, watching the realization spread through the crowd like dawn breaking over a dark landscape. He could see the exact moment when understanding hit Martha, could watch the transformation on her face from worry to grief to something that looked almost like wonder. This wasn't about proving himself to young cowboys or reclaiming his lost glory. This was about choosing dignity over decline, about facing death the same way he'd once faced bulls with courage and on his own terms. The terminal diagnosis reframed everything that had happened in the past hour, transforming the evening from entertainment to something approaching sacrament. The cruel dare from Jake and his friends had inadvertently given Jeb exactly what he'd been looking for, without knowing it, a chance to die as himself rather than as the broken shell of who he used to be. Jake Morrison stood frozen in horror as the implications of the medical letter became clear to those around him. What he'd intended as humiliation had become something else entirely, a final act of courage from a man who had nothing left to lose and everything to prove, not to the world but to himself. The weight of responsibility threatened to crush him as he realized that his cruel joke had become the catalyst for what might be a man's last moments on earth. "Oh God," Jake whispered, his face pale with genuine anguish. "What have I done?" But even as the question hung in the air, Jake began to understand that perhaps, in his thoughtless cruelty, he had given Jeb Rawlins something precious, a chance to die on his own terms, to go out the way he'd lived in his prime, facing down forces that could kill him without flinching. It was a terrible gift, wrapped in shame and regret, but a gift nonetheless. Martha pressed the letter against her chest, tears streaming down her face as she looked up at the man she'd loved for 30 years. Everything made sense now, his calm acceptance of the dare, his methodical preparation, the way he'd held Tommy's rosary beads like a man making peace with his maker. This wasn't about redemption or proving anything to anyone. This was about choosing how his story would end. "Jeb," she called up to him, her voice breaking with emotion. "You don't have to do this. We can fight it together. There are treatments. There are—" He looked down at her with eyes that held all the love and regret of 3 decades, all the words they'd never spoken, and all the time they'd never had. "Martha," he said gently, "I've been fighting for 30 years. I'm tired of fighting. I want to live for however long I've got left." The distinction was subtle but profound. The difference between existing in the shadow of guilt and shame and actually living with purpose and dignity. For 30 years, Jeb had been merely surviving, carrying the weight of Tommy's death like a stone in his chest. Now, facing his own mortality, he was choosing to spend his remaining time as the man he'd been before grief reshaped him. Doc Harrison understood perhaps better than anyone else what Jeb was choosing. As a physician, he'd seen too many patients waste their final months in futile battles against incurable diseases, fighting deaths that were inevitable while forgetting to live the lives that remained to them. Jeb was choosing differently, choosing 8 seconds of pure life over months of gradual decline. The crowd had grown quiet again, but it was a different kind of silence now, not the breathless anticipation of entertainment, but the reverent hush that comes in the presence of someone making peace with mortality. They were witnessing something sacred, something that transcended sports or spectacle and touched the deepest truths about courage and dignity and the choices people make when everything else falls away. Widowmaker shifted beneath Jeb, the massive bull growing restless with the delay. The animal's instincts told him that something was about to happen, that the tension in the air was building toward the moment when he could finally express his nature fully and completely. Bulls, Jeb knew, understood honesty in ways that people often didn't. They responded to genuine courage and could sense fear or doubt with supernatural accuracy. As Jeb settled himself more firmly on the bull's back, adjusting his grip on the rope that would be his lifeline for the next 8 seconds, he felt a strange sense of peace descending over him. For the first time in 30 years, he was exactly where he belonged, doing exactly what he was meant to do. Not because he had to prove anything to anyone, but because this was who he was at his core, a man who faced dangerous things with calm courage and accepted the consequences of his choices without complaint. The gate operators stood ready, their hands on the mechanism that would release Widowmaker into the arena. The bull sensed their readiness and coiled himself like a spring, every muscle in his massive body preparing for the explosion of movement that would follow the opening of the gate. "Ready when you are," called the gateman, waiting for Jeb's signal. Jeb looked out over the crowd one final time, seeing faces that had transformed from curious to concerned to genuinely awed by what they were witnessing. These people had come expecting entertainment and found themselves present for something far more profound, a man's final act of self-definition, his refusal to let death diminish who he was or who he'd been. He found Martha's face in the crowd, saw the love and grief and desperate hope there, and nodded once, a gesture that carried 30 years of unspoken affection and regret. Then he looked toward the gate and gave the signal that would either kill him or set him free. "Turn him loose." The revelation of the cancer diagnosis rippled through the crowd like a shockwave, transforming the atmosphere from anticipation to something approaching reverence. People who had come for entertainment found themselves witnesses to something far more profound, a man's final act of self-definition, his refusal to let death diminish the essence of who he was. Martha clutched the medical letter against her chest, her tears falling freely now as she looked up at the man she'd loved through 3 decades of separation and silence. The clinical language of the diagnosis, extensive metastatic disease, poor prognosis, palliative care recommended, felt like a vocabulary of loss. Each medical term, another nail in the coffin of dreams she'd never quite allowed herself to acknowledge. Doc Harrison stood beside her, his weathered face grave with the particular understanding that came from delivering similar news too many times in his long career. He'd seen patients respond to terminal diagnoses in countless ways, with rage, with denial, with desperate bargaining for time they didn't have. But he'd rarely seen anyone choose to face death with such deliberate courage, such careful attention to dignity and meaning. "How long has he known?" Martha whispered, her voice barely audible above the hushed murmur of the crowd. 3 days, Doc replied, reading the date on the letter. Just 3 days to make peace with everything. The time frame was staggering in its brevity. 3 days to absorb the reality of his own mortality, to decide how to spend whatever time remained, to choose between fighting a battle he couldn't win and embracing the life he had left. Most people would have needed weeks or months to process such news, but Jeb had somehow distilled his response into this single moment of pure intention. The crowd had grown so quiet that individual voices carried with startling clarity. Children asked their parents why everyone looked so sad. Elderly spectators who remembered their own brushes with mortality wiped away tears they hadn't expected to shed. Young cowboys who had come expecting to watch an old man embarrass himself instead found themselves confronting their own assumptions about courage and dignity and the way a life should end. Jake Morrison stood frozen with horror and something that might have been awe, watching his crew dare transform into something sacred. The weight of what he'd set in motion pressed down on him like a physical thing, the understanding that his thoughtless cruelty had somehow become the catalyst for a dying man's final act of grace. "We have to stop this," he said desperately to his friends, but even as he spoke the words, he knew they were meaningless. Some forces, once set in motion, could not be recalled. Some moments carried their own momentum, their own terrible logic that had to play out regardless of intention or regret. Billy Hutchins shook his head slowly, his own face pale with dawning understanding. "Can't stop it now," he said quietly. "Look at him. He's not doing this for us anymore. Maybe he never was." The truth of that observation was visible to anyone who looked carefully at Jeb's bearing as he sat on Widowmaker's back. This wasn't the desperate gamble of a broken man seeking redemption through reckless endangerment. This was the calculated choice of someone who had weighed his options and decided that 8 seconds of pure life was worth whatever risk came with them. In the chute, Jeb felt the shift in the crowd's energy, sensed the transformation from entertainment to something approaching sacrament. The knowledge that his terminal diagnosis was now public felt oddly liberating, removing the weight of secrets and pretense. For the first time in 30 years, he was exactly who he appeared to be, a man facing death with whatever courage he could muster. He reached into his boot and touched the small object hidden there, drawing comfort from its familiar weight and texture. Tommy's lucky penny, a 1987 Lincoln cent that his son had carried to every rodeo, convinced that it brought protection and good fortune. Jeb had found it in Tommy's gear bag after the funeral, had carried it with him through 3 decades of wandering and guilt, a talisman that connected him to the boy who had believed in luck and love and the essential goodness of the world. The penny had been with Tommy when he died, had failed to protect him from Diablo's hooves and horns, but somehow its presence in Jeb's boot felt like a blessing rather than a mockery. Not protection from harm, but connection to something larger than fear or pain, the simple faith of a young man who had loved his father completely and trusted him to come home safe. "Tommy," Jeb whispered, so quietly that only he could hear, "I'm ready now, son. I'm finally ready." The words carried the weight of 3 decades worth of guilt and grief, but also something else, a sense of completion, of coming full circle to a place where father and son could meet again on equal terms. Not as the failed protector and the victim, but as 2 people who had loved each other deeply and paid the price that love sometimes demanded. Widowmaker shifted beneath him, the massive bull's patience finally wearing thin. The animal could sense the emotional currents flowing around him, could feel the tension building toward the moment when he would be allowed to express his nature fully and completely. His muscles coiled like springs, his breathing deepened, and his eyes took on the particular focus that preceded explosive action. The stock contractors stood ready at the gate, their hands steady on the release mechanism, despite the unprecedented nature of what they were about to witness. These men had opened gates for thousands of riders, had seen triumph and disaster in equal measure, but none of them had ever released a bull for someone they knew was dying. The weight of that knowledge sat heavy on their shoulders, but they also understood that their job was to honor the rider's choice, whatever that choice might be. Martha found herself praying, the words coming automatically despite years of church attendance that had been more habit than faith. "Please," she whispered, not sure if she was asking for Jeb's safety or for his peace, not certain whether she wanted him to survive the ride or simply to find whatever he was looking for in those 8 seconds. The prayer felt strange on her lips, weighted with complications she couldn't untangle. Part of her wanted to scream at the gateman to stop, to refuse to open the chute, to deny Jeb the chance to risk his life for whatever meaning he thought he might find. But another part of her understood that this was his choice to make, his life to spend as he saw fit, his death to meet on his own terms. Around the arena, similar internal struggles played out in countless hearts and minds. Parents tried to explain to their children why sometimes people chose dangerous things, why courage didn't always mean staying safe. Young cowboys confronted their own assumptions about aging and dignity and the way legends should end. Old-timers remembered their own moments of reckoning, their own times when everything that mattered hung in the balance of a single choice. The arena announcer, overwhelmed by the emotional weight of what was happening, finally abandoned any pretense of routine commentary. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said quietly, his voice carrying clearly through the sound system, "what we're witnessing tonight is something that goes beyond sport or entertainment. This is about the choices we make when everything else falls away, about the courage it takes to face the hardest truths of our lives." His words seemed to crystallize something for the gathered crowd, giving them permission to acknowledge that they were present for something sacred rather than merely spectacular. The silence that followed was complete, broken only by the sound of breathing and the occasional shuffle of feet as people shifted to get better views of what might be the most important 8 seconds of their lives. Jeb adjusted his grip one final time, feeling the rope that would connect him to Widowmaker's back, the thin line between staying on and flying off into space. His weathered hands found their position automatically, muscle memory taking over from conscious thought. 40 years of experience distilled into instinctive knowledge about balance and timing and the essential rhythm that existed between man and beast. The gate operators looked to him for the final signal, waiting for the nod that would release 1,500 pounds of fury into the arena. The moment stretched between them, heavy with anticipation and weighted with meaning that none of them fully understood, but all of them felt. In his boot, Tommy's penny pressed against his ankle like a small blessing. In his pocket, the championship buckle and rosary beads carried the weight of memory and faith. In his heart, 30 years of guilt and grief prepared to be transformed into something else. Not redemption, exactly, but acceptance of the complex truth that love and loss were inseparable, that fathers and sons were bound by ties that death could not break. Jeb looked out over the crowd one final time, seeing faces that reflected every emotion. Human beings were capable of experiencing fear and hope, love and loss, the terrible beauty of watching someone choose courage over safety. These people had become his witnesses, his congregation, the souls who would carry forward whatever meaning could be found in the next 8 seconds. He found Martha's face in the crowd, saw the love and terror there, and understood that whatever happened next, he would not die unloved or unremembered. The knowledge felt like grace, like the answer to prayers he'd been too proud or too broken to offer for 30 years. "Turn him loose," Jeb said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the hushed arena. The gatemen nodded, their hands tightening on the release mechanism, and time held its breath. The gate exploded open with a sound like thunder, and Widowmaker burst from the chute with the fury of a force of nature finally unleashed. 1,500 pounds of pure violence and muscle erupted into the arena, the massive bull's black hide gleaming under the lights as he launched himself into the air with a power that seemed to defy gravity itself. Jeb felt the familiar sensation of controlled chaos beneath him, the way the world suddenly reduced to nothing but balance and instinct and the essential rhythm that existed between man and beast. His body remembered this feeling, even though his mind had tried to forget it. The explosive motion that could snap a spine or crush a skull, the terrible beauty of being carried by something that wanted nothing more than to destroy him. Widowmaker spun left out of the chute, exactly as Sam Rodriguez had predicted, but the bull's movements were more violent than any description could convey. Each rotation whipped Jeb's body through space with forces that would have shattered a younger man's confidence. But something ancient and unbreakable in him responded to the challenge, with the calm certainty of water finding its level. The crowd gasped as one entity, watching the old cowboy absorb punishment that would have broken riders half his age. His free hand stayed high, his balance perfect despite the bull's attempts to dislodge him through sheer savagery. This wasn't the desperate clinging of someone in over his head. This was the fluid response of a master craftsman working with familiar tools. 2 seconds. 3 seconds. The timer on the arena scoreboard counted down the moments that separated Jeb from either triumph or disaster, each digit carrying weight that went far beyond simple measurement. The crowd had fallen completely silent, understanding somehow that they were witnessing something that transcended ordinary sport or entertainment. Martha pressed her hands to her mouth, tears streaming down her face as she watched the man she'd loved for 30 years find grace in the most unlikely place. This wasn't the broken-down stable hand who had lived in her barn for 3 years. This was Jeb Rawlins, the legend, the 3-time champion, the cowboy who had once made riding the unrideable look effortless. But it was more than that. It was also the father who had lost his son, the man who had carried guilt like a stone in his chest for 3 decades, finally finding a way to transform that weight into something approaching peace. Every move he made on Widowmaker's back was both technique and prayer, skill and penance, the physical expression of a soul making peace with itself. 4 seconds. 5 seconds. Widowmaker straightened out of his spin and began the serious bucking that had destroyed countless riders, his massive hindquarters kicking toward the arena lights, while his front hooves pounded the dirt with the rhythm of a war drum. The bull's strategy was clear: use raw power to overwhelm whatever skill his rider might possess, rely on youth and strength, and the simple mathematics of violence. But Jeb moved with the bull rather than against him, finding the rhythm that existed beneath the chaos, the essential pattern that all great riders learned to read like music. His weathered hands maintained their grip on the rope, while his body flowed with Widowmaker's movements, absorbing the impact rather than fighting it, becoming part of the violence rather than its victim. In the crowd, Jake Morrison watched with growing awe and horror, understanding that his cruel dare had unleashed something magnificent and terrible. The old cowboy he had mocked was revealing himself to be exactly what some of the older spectators claimed: a genuine legend, a man whose name had once meant something in the world of professional rodeo. Doc Harrison found himself holding his breath, his medical training warring with his human amazement as he watched a 68-year-old man with terminal cancer ride one of the most dangerous bulls in the country with a grace that defied both age and disease. This wasn't recklessness or desperation, this was artistry, the kind of pure skill that elevated sport into something approaching art. 6 seconds. 7 seconds. The arena timer continued its relentless countdown while Jeb and Widowmaker engaged in their ancient dance of challenge and response. The bull's fury was beginning to take on a different quality now, confusion mixing with his rage as he encountered resistance unlike anything he had faced before. This rider didn't fight him or fear him, he simply existed in harmony with the violence, finding beauty in the midst of chaos. And in that moment, as the 8th second approached, Jeb felt something shift in the space between heartbeats, not just in his body or his balance, but in his soul. The weight he had carried for 30 years, the guilt, the shame, the crushing responsibility for Tommy's death began to lift like fog burning away in morning sunlight. He was no longer riding for redemption or proving anything to anyone. He was simply being who he was, doing what he was born to do, finding in these seconds of pure physical challenge a truth that had eluded him for 3 decades, that love and loss were inseparable, that fathers and sons were connected by bonds that death could not break, that some forms of grace could only be found in the most dangerous places. 8 seconds. The arena timer hit 0 with a sound that seemed to echo through eternity, and something magical happened in that instant. Time itself seemed to pause. Suspended between the tick that marked completion and the reality that Jeb Rawlins was still astride Widowmaker's back, still moving in perfect harmony with 1,500 pounds of barely controlled fury. But more than that, impossibly more than that, Jeb felt a presence beside him in those final moments, not a hallucination born of adrenaline or the oxygen debt that came with extreme physical exertion, but something real and profound and unmistakably familiar. Tommy was there, riding alongside him in the space between heartbeats, his young face bright with the joy that had always lit him up when he watched his father ride. "You did it, Dad." Tommy's voice came to him clear as morning air, carrying none of the pain or fear from that terrible day in New Mexico. 8 seconds. You always said that was all that mattered. Jeb's eyes filled with tears that had nothing to do with the wind whipping past his face as Widowmaker continued his powerful bucking beneath them. In that moment outside of time, father and son were together again, not as the guilt-ridden survivor and his victim, but as two cowboys sharing the pure joy of a perfect ride. "I'm sorry, son," Jeb whispered, his words lost in the thunder of hooves and the roar of blood in his ears. "I'm so sorry I couldn't save you." "Nothing to save me from, Dad," Tommy replied, his spirit radiating the peace that had eluded Jeb for 3 decades. "I died doing what I loved, trying to be like the man I respected most in the world. That's not a tragedy, that's a gift." The profound truth of those words hit Jeb like a physical blow, reshaping 30 years of self-recrimination in an instant. Tommy hadn't died because his father failed to protect him. He had died pursuing the same dangerous grace that had defined both their lives, following a path that he had chosen freely because it led towards something beautiful and meaningful and worth the risk. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the 8-second buzzer sounded, but the ride continued, Jeb maintaining his perfect form, while Widowmaker seemed almost to sense that something extraordinary was happening. The bull's bucking took on a different quality, still powerful but somehow less violent, as if he too recognized the presence of something sacred in the arena. Martha felt her heart stop as she watched Jeb's face transform, saw an expression of peace and joy replace the lines of pain and guilt that had marked him for so long. She couldn't hear his conversation with Tommy's spirit, but she could see its effects written clearly in his features, the lifting of a burden so heavy that its absence was visible from the grandstands. 9 seconds, 10 seconds. Jeb should have dismounted by now, should have thrown himself clear of the bull's back and landed safely on the arena floor. But instead, he remained mounted, riding with a grace that seemed to transcend the physical laws that governed such things, moving in harmony with an animal that had never been ridden to completion. And then, in a gesture that would be talked about for generations, Jeb Rawlins performed the most difficult dismount in rodeo, not a desperate leap to safety, but a controlled, graceful slide from Widowmaker's back that ended with him landing upright on his feet in the arena dirt, his arms raised in a gesture of pure triumph. Widowmaker, as if released from some spell, stopped bucking immediately. The massive bull turned to look at the old cowboy, who had accomplished what no one else had managed, and for a moment they regarded each other with what could only be described as mutual respect. Then the bull trotted peacefully toward the exit gate, his job complete, and his reputation somehow enhanced rather than diminished. The silence that followed was complete and profound, thousands of people trying to process what they had just witnessed. This hadn't been simply a successful bull ride, it had been a transformation, a transcendence, a moment when the ordinary laws of physics and probability had been suspended to allow something miraculous to occur. Then, As if some dam had burst, the crowd erupted in applause that started as a whisper and built to a roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the arena. People were on their feet, crying and cheering, and bearing witness to something that none of them would ever forget. They had come, expecting entertainment, and instead had been present for resurrection. Martha was the first to reach him, vaulting the arena fence with an agility that surprised her and running across the dirt to where Jeb stood, still looking slightly dazed by what had just occurred. She threw her arms around him and held him as if she could anchor him to the earth through sheer force of will, feeling his body trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline and something that felt like joy. "I saw him," Jeb whispered into her ear, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Martha, I saw my boy. He was right there with me." She held him tighter, understanding that whatever had happened in those impossible seconds beyond 8 had healed something in him that 30 years of grief had broken. The man in her arms was no longer carrying the weight of failure and guilt. He was, finally, completely free. The 8-second timer on the scoreboard continued to flash, but everyone in the arena understood that time had become meaningless, that they had all been witness to something that existed outside the normal boundaries of what was possible or logical or safe. Jeb Rawlins had ridden Widowmaker, but more than that, he had ridden his way back to himself. 3 weeks later, Jeb sat on Martha's front porch as the Texas sun painted the sky in shades of copper and gold, watching another day surrender to evening with the particular peace that comes to those who have made their final peace with the world. The cancer was advancing exactly as the doctors had predicted, but something fundamental had changed in the way he carried the burden of his mortality. Where once there had been fear and regret, now there was simply acceptance, tinged with gratitude for time that had been given meaning. The story of his ride had spread far beyond Dry Gulch, rippling outward through the rodeo community and beyond like ripples on a still pond. Newspaper reporters had come calling, wanting to understand how a 68-year-old man with terminal cancer had accomplished what no professional rider had managed in 4 years. Television crews had requested interviews, seeking to capture the human interest angle of the dying cowboy, who had found his legend again. But Jeb had politely declined most of their requests, understanding that some stories were too personal, too sacred, to be reduced to sound bites and feel-good segments on the evening news. The ride belonged to him and Tommy and the people who had been present to witness it. Trying to explain it to those who hadn't been there would be like trying to describe color to someone who had never seen. Martha emerged from the house carrying 2 cups of coffee and settled into the chair beside him, a routine they had established in the weeks since the rodeo. The diagnosis had brought them together in ways that 30 years of separation had not, stripping away the careful distance they had maintained and replacing it with the honest intimacy of people who understood that time was precious and not to be wasted on formalities. "Jake Morrison came by again today," she said, offering him one of the cups. "Still feels terrible about what happened." Jeb accepted the coffee with hands that trembled slightly more each day, the cancer's progression evident in small but unmistakable ways. "That boy needs to learn that sometimes the worst things we do lead to the best things that happen. Can't carry guilt for being part of something larger than what he intended." The wisdom in those words came from hard experience, from someone who had finally learned to distinguish between responsibility and blame, between the choices that belonged to him and the forces that belonged to the universe. Jake had indeed visited several times, bringing flowers and apologies and a desperate need for absolution that Jeb had been happy to provide. The young cowboy had been transformed by witnessing the ride, had seen his cruel dare become the catalyst for something miraculous, and found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about strength and courage, and the way legends were made. He'd started attending church again, had apologized to his parents for years of thoughtless behavior, had begun treating the older ranch hands with the respect that comes from understanding that everyone carries stories worth knowing. Doc Harrison stopped by earlier, Martha continued. Says the whole county's talking about starting some kind of memorial fund. Want to name it after you and Tommy. Jeb smiled at that, imagining his son's reaction to having his name on a scholarship that would help young cowboys pursue their dreams safely. Tommy would have liked the idea that his death might prevent others, that his story could teach rather than just sadden. That's good, he said simply. Boy always wanted to help people. On the table beside his chair sat a modest championship buckle, nothing fancy or expensive, but polished to a shine that caught the last rays of sunlight. The townspeople had presented it to him the week after the rodeo, a simple gesture that meant more than any of the elaborate trophies from his professional days. This buckle represented something different, not just skill or courage, but the kind of grace that transforms suffering into meaning. The cancer was winning its war against his body, but Jeb had found something more valuable than time in those final weeks. He had found peace, the kind that comes to people who have faced their deepest fears and discovered that love endures beyond loss, that some forms of redemption can only be earned through the most dangerous kinds of courage. He thought often of Tommy in these quiet moments, but the memories no longer carried the weight of guilt and failure. Instead, they were filled with the joy of a father, remembering a son who had lived fully and loved completely, who had died pursuing something beautiful and meaningful, even if the ending was tragic. I want to tell you something, Jeb said quietly, his voice carrying the particular weight that comes before important revelations. That night, when I was on Widowmaker, Tommy was there with me. Not like a memory or a dream, he was really there. Martha nodded, understanding that some truths transcended the boundaries of what seemed possible or logical. Love, she had learned, was not bound by the laws that governed ordinary experience. It could reach across decades of separation, could bridge the gap between life and death, could transform 8 seconds of courage into a lifetime of meaning. I know, she said simply. I could see it on your face. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun completed its journey toward the horizon, two people who had found each other again at the end of all things, grateful for whatever time remained. The cancer would take Jeb within months, the doctors said, but he would not die as he had lived for 30 years, broken and guilt-ridden and haunted by failure. He would die as himself, as the man he had been before grief reshaped him, surrounded by love and carrying the knowledge that some stories end not with tragedy but with grace. The ride had given him that gift, those 8 seconds of perfect courage that had somehow contained enough meaning to redeem 3 decades of sorrow. As the last light faded from the Texas sky, Jeb Rawlins closed his eyes and smiled, feeling the presence of his son like a warm hand on his shoulder, knowing that when his time came, he would not be traveling alone. Some journeys, he had learned, were meant to be shared, and some love was strong enough to transcend even death itself. In the distance, a bull bellowed in the gathering darkness, and the sound carried no threat, no challenge, only the simple acknowledgement of one force of nature recognizing another, honoring the courage it takes to face the dangerous things and find beauty in the midst of fear. The legend of Jeb Rawlins was complete.